Welcome to Extra Takes, hosted by Northland Church Lead Pastor Dr. Joshua Laxton. Join us each week as Pastor Josh reveals the rest of the story behind his sermons. We'll discuss how those who follow Christ can live out a biblical vision for the church in our world today.
Well, hello, Northland family and friends. Welcome to another episode of Extra Takes. I'm your co-host, PJ, along with Matt Shiles.
How you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. I'm wonderful. I got a good night's rest from a long weekend, but I have most of my family, they're gone for the next couple of weeks at a camp in North Carolina.
Okay.
So that's where I felt really lazy after preaching all weekend because I sat on the couch and I didn't move for like 6 hours.
That sounds
so
awesome.
I caught up on The Chosen.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Watched
season
a little bit
4?
of golf. Yeah, season 4.
Okay.
Yeah, I caught up, and I guess they make live an episode on Sundays, and so I have not seen the latest.
Okay.
But I know what it's coming.
Okay.
I've read the Bible.
I haven't gotten into season 4 yet, so no spoilers. Don't spoil it
Well,
for
if
me.
you know your Bible, you'll be spoiled there, Slick.
There's some extra stuff there.
Well, there actually is some extra stuff. I'm like, yeah, but I know what they're trying to do. Listen, it doesn't affect me the way it affects other people, but
yeah, there's a
they take some
reason.
liberties.
There's a reason they're able to make it a multi season show. Yeah.
So.
All right. So what we're going to do today is we have a lot to talk about because we were in Jeremiah 29, wrapping up the T.E.D series.
Yeah.
And we're going to do a part 1, part 2. So this week we're going to really dig into that first talk.
Yep. How then shall we not live?
Yep. There was 5 points.
Yep.
I think there's enough there for us to.
A little bit.
Yeah. And then next week we'll do part 2, which will be how then shall we live, and that will come out right after June Jam. So we would encourage all you guys, make sure 11 o'clock on June 30th, make sure you come to June Jam. It's going to be a wonderful time of gathering together. When we did it last year.
You know what June Jam stands for? Jesus and me. Just joking. No, it doesn't. I just thought of that. I just thought of that. So, but no. So hey, just to clarify, June Jam doesn't stand for anything. But if you wanted it to stand for something, it could stand for Jesus and me.
Breaking news. You heard it first. Jesus and me. That might catch on. You better watch out.
Yeah.
So let's dig into this outline. I'm going to give the entire outline, the how then shall we not live, and also the how then shall we live, just to give us kind of a reminder and a context of these two messages, and they obviously relate to one another because they're from Jeremiah 29. So she had 5 points of 5 things God did not tell the exiles to do living in Babylon. First, God didn't tell them to mourn the nostalgic days of old. He didn't tell them to withdraw from the city. He didn't tell them to retaliate or revolt against the Babylonians. He didn't tell them to transform Babylon into another Israel. That one's interesting. God didn't tell them to assimilate into the culture of Babylon. And you ended that by really laying out then how does this relate to Jesus and how Jesus really lived and responded to those. The second talk was how then shall we live? God tells them to live on mission. God tells them to get back to the basics of being human. God tells them to work for the peace of the city. God tells them to pray for the city. And finally, he tells them to beware of false preachers in exile, because we know that will happen. And you concluded by reminding us of those 3 pillars of faithful presence.
Yep. All throughout, I try to remind people what the 3 pillars of faithful presence are. And I try to give the summary of how you actually see it in Jeremiah 29.
Yeah. So this was the robust missiology. This was the rough eschatology. And this was the rudimentary understanding of government. And you concluded by saying, we can thrive in a foreign land through faithful presence as we trust our loving Father.
Yeah.
You've been looking forward to this message for quite a while.
Yeah, because I think it gives, because I did share that I could have started with this message to give you a big framework, and then you kind of show throughout Daniel, because Jeremiah 29 is the 30,000-foot view. Daniel, basically 1 through 6, is the ground level view. So I could have started with Jeremiah 29 and then went into Daniel and looked at how this plays out. But this go round, I wanted to start with why we're so divided. I think that's where a lot of people just got confused, like what is this series going to be about?
Yeah.
Because I try to talk about the division in America and where it all came from and why we're so divided, because in some sense we just didn't wake up one night and we're so divided.
No.
It was a lot of stuff in the air that was planted centuries ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I wanted to show you that, and then to introduce the three pillars of faithful presence. And then throughout the journey, we would look at basically a case study of Daniel, and look at Daniel and his 3 friends, and then also add some practical stuff throughout, but then end with, all right, here's let's kind of end with tying all of this up into a framework. So that's kind of how I wanted to do it this go round.
Yeah.
So if I was writing a book per se on this, I would probably start with Jeremiah 29.
Oh, I see.
And then let that be the framework. And then that we're looking at how it plays out in both the Old Testament and even the New Testament.
I see. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So let's go through these 5 things. For each of them, you had a principle or 2, and for each of those, I have some comments trying to kind of summarize or just add some additional commentary. So. This first point, God didn't tell them to mourn the nostalgic days of old. The principle, 2 principles. Sometimes the preferred past can paralyze us in the present and prevent us from positively engaging in the future. And the second one, if you're busy weeping for the past, we won't be working in the present for the future. And what I took from that is really being too focused on the past has consequences. I don't think we always realize that.
Yeah.
And it can really limit our effectiveness in the present and the future. So any additional thoughts on those principles?
I mean, I get why I get why we have a tendency as human beings to get stuck.
Yeah.
I mean, it goes back to the series on transitions.
Yeah.
That you have multiple options in terms of a transition.
Yeah.
And one of the options is to get stuck, which is why we have that phrase, stuck in transition.
Yeah.
And when you have cultural shifts like we have had that have been very tumultuous and that have been paradigmatic in terms of these large, kind of moral shifts in our culture, there is a tendency to want to long for what we would call the good old days, what some would perceive as a golden age.
Yeah.
And that's why I even mentioned the Leave It to Beaver and Mayberry days, is that's kind of what many Americans have, is that you can even look at the progression of our society from TV shows.
Mm-hmm.
And now the kind of TV shows that we have versus the TV shows of the 50s and 60s. Okay, so our country, our culture has greatly changed, and so there's there is a tendency to want to get stuck in it. But if you're stuck in it wanting something, here's the thing, and that's part of that's part of the whole toothpaste out of the tube thing, is that you're not going back to the Mayberry days. That day, that ship has sailed. You're not going back. You're not going back to the Leave It to Beaver days. And so you can long for it all day long, and you can, in some sense, try to fight to try to reclaim that. but you're not. It's so you have to now reframe this period in which you are, and that's why it's so important to reframe it in a biblical way.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what I would say is that don't get paralyzed from longing for a past. What does God want in the present, and what does He want you to work for and towards in the future?
Yeah.
That because that's what, again, that you go back. He's not asking them to go back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because when you look at it, even from the standpoint of what we'll look at next week in terms of how then shall we live, God's going to work out the eschatological future of hope for them.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, what He actually wants them to do, and again, that was the whole point of this is what I want you to do.
Yeah.
But He's not telling them to mourn and sit down by the river and cry yourself to sleep. He's like, I actually, I got stuff for you to do here. And that's part of why the church has to wake up and quit trying to reclaim things that in some sense you're not necessarily going to reclaim. But you can proclaim something. So I'm trying not to get ahead. I'm trying to stay in the moment of what He didn't say. And then we can talk about what He did say.
Yeah, but they're interconnected.
They are interconnected, which is why I love the way I was able to do it this go around as opposed to preaching. There was one time I did 2 full 55-minute messages on both of these.
And there's enough there for that.
Gosh. I mean, yeah, there's yeah.
Yeah, I liked how you said that God is working out the eschatological
Thank
you very much.
So he's
working that out. Yeah. But we don't have to work it out. They didn't have to work it out.
No.
And that's what we often do is saying, that's our job. No, that's His job. That's His role. And I think that's what we do a lot of times, and that's where we fall into this trap of like trying to take control. As we try to pull back and take control, we're really trying to do God's job and not just be faithful in what He's called us to do.
Yeah, that's part of where I think it's okay. I think it's okay to lament. Like I would say that Lamentations was Jeremiah lamenting over what was and what should not have been. So it wasn't that anything was wrong with Psalm 137 in terms of their lament of sitting down by the river and not necessarily wanting to sing songs, but God didn't tell them to stay there. So there is a grieving, there is a loss.
Yeah.
And be aware of that. Lament that. And in some sense, I would even say confess. I mean, this is where you have Daniel in Daniel chapter 9. He's going to utter this large corporate confession over the sin of God's people, which led them into that.
Yeah.
And sure, I think there is, and really throughout the history of America, the church has been really found to have been sinning in quite a few different ways.
Yeah.
So it's okay to lament the nation and the shifts, and it's okay to lament the church's, I would say, malpractice of how we have not practiced the faith like we should have. But if you get stuck in a lament, or you get stuck in some sense mourning what once was without working towards what God wants, that's the issue. Yeah. And I do think that because of the way culture changes and culture has shifted, we find ourselves in long transitions in the sense of, 10, 20, 30-year transitions. Because morality just doesn't, in some sense, change corporately overnight.
No.
There are these shifts. And so, like I was talking to somebody that actually lives in Oregon, and so they came up to me this past week and they loved what they heard, and they were saying, though, we've lived in Oregon so long, like, we're like, oh, yeah. But when you have lived in the South, or you live in, even in some sense, a state like Florida, in certain pockets, this might be somewhat newer for you.
So like being in exile.
Being in exile. They're like, we've been in exile for 30 years, in Oregon, and then in California or New York City. I mean, but what my point is that transitions, these large paradigmatic cultural shifts, that they don't happen in a vacuum.
Yeah.
And so that's why it can take a while for the church to, in some sense, find her footing to go, okay, all right, this is enough lamenting, this is enough mourning, it is time now to get to work in what God has called us to do.
Yeah.
And as you can see in Psalm 137, there is a difficulty in moving on for God's people.
Yeah.
When they find themselves in a new foreign land, new foreign culture, new society, new worldview, new purpose around them, new ethics, new spiritual practices, and they're like fish out of water. Like what?
Yeah.
Where? Yeah.
Well, and that leads us to the second thing that God did not tell them to do, which was God didn't tell them to withdraw from the city. Two principles you shared: if we isolate, we will not be able to infiltrate. And second, if we become hermits, we can't be missionaries. As I reflect on that, we are the called out ones. We are set apart, but what I get from that is we're not set apart for our own good. And that's what we do when we isolate, we withdraw the us for no more. It's really, whether we recognize it or not, we're claiming, hey, this is for our good, our glory, not for God's glory.
Yeah.
And that's a scary place to be.
The tendency, though, for all of humans is to cluster around like-minded people.
Yeah.
So and I think I've shared this book on the podcast before a while back, but it's called The Big Sort, S-O-R-T, by Bill Bishop. And how, he's a sociologist, and what he did through research in his book is just show how we tend to cluster around like-minded people that look like us, talk like us, think like us, behave like us. And so it's a natural human inclination for the church to, in some sense, just cluster together and protect themselves from the outside world and the outside influences of the world. But that is not what God called them to do. I mean, this is what's fascinating. I mean, when you look at Daniel 1, they are literally learning the educational topics and themes of the Babylonians, and they're not rebelling against that. They're learning the literature, the arts of Babylon. Daniel is learning how to be, in some sense, an astrologer, how to interpret things through the stars. Like he's taught that. Yeah. But now he's not going to fully assimilate into the full-on out thinking of what he had been taught by the Babylonians. Yeah. Because one of the fascinating things that we can learn when you do a deeper dive on the wise men and the magi from the east coming to Jesus' birth, they saw a star. Yeah. Well, Daniel is going to teach them the prophecies that are found in Genesis about in some sense, the star. That when you see this star, that's going to be the sign that a king is rising for the Jews, and so in some sense he's going to use the educational ways of Babylon, but he's going to view them through the lens of Scripture. And he's going to teach them. And so hundreds of years even after Daniel goes off the scene, scholars would say that he was heavily influenced the vocation of wise men and magi. That's to the point that they see a star and they travel 900 miles to come see the king of the Jews.
That's amazing.
So, nevertheless, the whole idea is that he's not withdrawing totally. He's just maintaining. He's not even withdrawing. He's maintaining his distinctiveness while he's in some sense taught a way of living that is not fully in alignment with Yahweh.
And that takes some intentionality. I mean, he is constantly filtering that.
And that goes back to what we talked about in the thriving kit for Babylon.
Yeah.
Is that you need to be a potted plant. So what is the soil? What soil is your heart in? King Josiah reinstituted the law. And they were kids during that time. Because after Josiah goes off the scene and he passes away, they don't last very long until Nebuchadnezzar comes in and takes Jerusalem. So the soil of the hearts of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were the soil of Josiah, which is part of why they are able to maintain their distinctiveness, although they were taught the ways of Babylon.
Ooh.
And this would even go, so amazing. People would say, and here we'll wade into these waters. So, okay, do you go to public school? Do you go to private school? Do you go to home school? Whatever the Lord tells you to do. So, because I'm not going to sit here and say
there isn't a right way,
that there's a right way. Now, I would say that it's perfectly okay to send your kid to public school. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they went to public school. Think about what they heard in their public school. Now, I do think that we're in a day and age because, and here's where I've actually shifted a little bit of at least my thinking on this over the last, actually, say a couple years, being here in Florida.
Yeah.
Given the fact that Florida has the structure they do for education, and that there is money for people to send their kid wherever they want to send them, and knowing the trends of church attendance, that they're on the decline, and also knowing that parents aren't necessarily armed and equipped the way they should be or need to be in order to fully be able to disciple their kid at home through, just through their life, then I am perfectly okay with supplementing the discipleship of children through the structures that we have as Floridians to send our kid to private school, which is one of the things that I love about our partnership with the ecclesial school, is that it is in a very affordable school, private school that is going to teach the tenets of the faith and to teach a biblical worldview. And I think that is a very, but I also think that, hey, listen, you can make sure that you're intentional with your kid at home, make sure that you are part of and partnered with a local church, and send your kid to public school, and they can turn out like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Or you can homeschool and use the schooling both from a spiritual and educational component, and you can be the one discipling your kids from the time they are kindergarten all the way into the time they are graduating high school. So I'm for all of the, again, I really am for all of the above, but the key is that their educational component is also being supplemented and taught the spiritual component of how to look at the world.
Yeah. I think that's a great example. It's a great example of how nuanced it can be. And we really do have to get away from the black and white, because the world has changed and is constantly changing, and there's challenges and positives with each of those, and regardless of which of those parents choose, the reliance on the Spirit does not go away. Right.
No. And the biggest thing is, and I think the potted plant is just a good image, is that you just want to make sure that the soil of your children's heart is centered around Jesus. Because because these 4 teenagers, they're taking that soil with them to foreign soil.
Yeah.
So however you're going to, which ultimately I think the parents should be the ones that's at least focused on trying to pour in that soil in their heart, even though you can't change their heart by yourself.
Yeah.
Like you can do all of the right things, but you're leaving it up to the Spirit of God. So just know that the primary discipleship focus from a kid's standpoint should be the parent. But that's where the church should come alongside and be supplemental. That's where private schools should be supplemental. So if you're saying that you need more supplemental help, yes. And so you can get it at church, you can get it at private school, you can give it, at home. Just know that if you send them to public school, there's going to be a little bit more work left to be done, though, that I do think that many Christian parents aren't adequately equipped for, and that's actually where we want to do better at Northland over the coming years, is make sure that we can equip you to be the primary discipler of your child or children. But that's the thought behind, not, making sure that you're not withdrawing, that you're very much integrated in part, but that you have the soil. I mean, that's the thing about these young men. They had the soil of their heart that allowed them, now, because you have to understand that there are a lot more exiles than just them, and a lot of those exiles actually assimilated. So they became very much part of the Babylonian culture. So that's why the minority is. You actually see the minority in Daniel.
Yeah, we hear about the minority. We don't necessarily see all the actions of the majority, but
which is why you go back to, I know we talked about Revelation last time we were here, because I'm going to be doing a series on Revelation 2 and 3. But the majority of the churches in the book of Revelation, they had assimilated, and there were some still parts that made them distinct, as they lived out the vision of Jesus. But then there were some parts of the church they very much assimilated, and they were just like Rome. So it's still that tendency, which is why we need to watch ourselves.
Great conversation. So let's look at number 3. God didn't tell them to retaliate or revolt against the Babylonians. Fascinating. So you said, if we seek calloused vengeance rooted in sin, we will not be able to share Christ's victory over sin. You said this again and again. We cannot fight like hell trying to reflect heaven.
Yeah, I like that.
I like that.
And I've said it, I don't know how many times, but
but that saying it that way is pretty succinct. I think that's helpful. And then another principle, the gospel doesn't call us to go on the counterattack, but to give a vision of a counterculture. So the question I have is, how is a counterculture different than going on the counterattack?
Yeah, so in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, he's going to tell his followers, and this is in Matthew 5, that a city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. And what Jesus is telling his followers is that you are a city within a city. So you are a micro city embedded into a larger macro city. And that's the imagery that we actually need to hold in terms of giving people a counter-cultural vision and alternative reality to what it means to be human and part of a new human race, the church, the corporate body of the church, versus trying to go on the counterattack and to maintain some kind of, moral piety, maintain some kind of whatever it may be into the kingdom of man. I mean, this is where I don't like. Please hear me. Like, again, these are things that I'm wrestling with, which is why I can wrestle with them on the podcast. I'm not going to wrestle with them on the stage. But if the Old Testament, if the Old Testament talks about how our righteousness in our own eyes is as filthy rags.
Mm-hmm.
Where does righteousness come from? Like even the psalmist, I think in Psalm 24, where do we get this forgiveness? So who may ascend the hill of the Lord? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, and who has not lifted up their soul to another. Where do we ultimately become in right standing with the Lord? Where do we ultimately get clean hands? From Jesus. So this in some sense, moral piety and righteousness devoid of the centrality of Jesus in God's eyes is as filthy rags. So again, I'm not saying, so I'm not saying that it's not, that we don't want a moral culture, but what we had, and this is what people had, Christians had referred to it as in the past, is that it was a moral therapeutic deism. That it was that our morality as a nation was never centered around Jesus. It was this kind of religiosity that we were moral in order to, in some sense, appease God. But God was never in some sense, the center of God was never the center. Again, this is why it was so important to see the distinction between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man. Yeah. God has never been the center of America. God has been, and this is the thing, and I'm not saying that, and somebody's like, are we saying that's a bad thing? But it's a kingdom of man thing. And God allows nations to rise, and he allows nations to fall. So the center of American life was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It wasn't the mission of God. It wasn't the glory of God. It wasn't the centrality of Jesus. It wasn't bowing down to him. So let's quit kidding ourselves about that. And so that's where I'm wrestling with this idea is that, okay, is it better to in some sense be a moral quote unquote country where we think people are saved versus letting, in some sense, licentiousness reign where the church can maintain her distinctiveness, so when all hell breaks loose and the thing comes crumbling down, there is an organism that is centered around Jesus that shows you what life should be, and that they begin to look and go, why is your family still intact? Why do you love the way you love? Why do you care the way you care? Because and that's why I quoted from Rodney Stark I think I quoted from him in the second part, but that's what happened in the Roman Empire. They're seeing the empire crumble. They're seeing their cities crumble, but they're actually seeing how the church had maintained her distinctiveness and how they added value and care and love to the city. Yeah. So again, I'm not saying that I want America just to become so amoral or immoral, but what I'm saying is let's not kid ourselves. Is that just because people far from Jesus are moral doesn't make them saved. That's not how one comes to know Jesus. That's not how one is reconciled to Jesus. That is not righteousness in the eyes of God. So I just want to make sure that, and that's the reason why I'm saying that the gospel doesn't call us to go on the counterattack. We're not trying to force people to be moral. That has never been our job, to force people to be. We are not the moral police. And that's kind of why I'm like, let's make sure our own house is in moral order before we go and talk about how immoral other people are.
Yeah, what I hear from you is a lot of opportunity if we lay down that battle, that fight of being the moral police. I understand where you're saying that, you're not wanting just, hell and chaos to reign.
No,
but there's opportunity.
Well,
there's tremendous opportunity as the world gets seemingly, or as America gets seemingly darker. What happens to the light? We look brighter.
That's what I would think. I mean, again, that's what I'm wrestling with. And it's not to say that we don't want to live in a just country. I still think that countries that are part of the kingdom of man can still be just. Because you go back to Romans, is that because every human being has been fashioned into the image of God, there is a law that God's law, his moral law, is written on our heart. So I do think that there are elements that still come out of humanity that gives at least glimmers of a moral law, which is why you just can't go around and murder people.
Yeah.
Which is why, like, you need to pursue justice. And so that there shouldn't be companies that are able just to do whatever they want to do and take advantage of people and exploit people. Because you don't want chaos. I mean, you do want order. But I do think that there are elements in our country where we're trying to fight for people to be biblical when the Bible's not even their authority. And that's where it was one of the things that I've shared before, and I did not share it in this series.
That series?
That series. Series, like,
You said series, and it sounded
then the series. Oh, yeah. So in this series, I haven't. Yeah, that's why Siri's talking to me.
It's funny.
So, but if you go back to the garden, God created Adam and Eve, and he had put them in this pre-fall garden. They are perfect, and he gave them one law: don't eat from this tree. And they ate from the tree. Now, in a perfect garden, if things go wrong, and now you're looking at a imperfect nation that was created, are we naive to believe that nothing's going to go wrong in an imperfect nation? I mean, here's a garden that is a perfect garden, the Garden of Eden, where God's glory dwelt in the garden. One law.
Wow.
And they broke the one law, and all hell broke loose. So that's what I'm just saying is, like, and then God didn't go on the counterattack. But he's going to create a countercultural people. I mean, that's the whole idea of Genesis 11 and Genesis 12.
Yeah.
Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, Babylon. Genesis 12, God calls Abraham and says, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to make you I'm going to do all of this. And through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So I'm not going here's my counterattack is a countercultural people. That's what God's doing.
Amen.
And then eventually, God will come. Jesus will come a second time. And I keep saying this. He's going to come a second time. And it won't be a counterattack. It will be a full-on out frontal assault and attack where the kingdoms of this world will be consumed, and the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdom of our God, and he will demolish sin once and for all. He will demolish those who had never trusted in him. He will completely do, and they will be thrown into the lake of fire, a second death. And they will live forever and ever separated from the Lord. So they're not, I don't believe in annihilation. No. They're going to live like they always wanted to live, completely devoid of God and his presence and his work. So that's why we got to give a counterculture, not a counterattack.
So with that in mind, it is interesting then to look at this fourth point, because God didn't tell them to transform Babylon into another Israel. I mean, you know, what you just laid out, the reality of hell. Well, yeah, let's transform Babylon. Let's go. We need to transform. But that's not what he told them to do. He said God is not calling the church to conquer, transform, and rule the world, but live in it as witnesses to him and his rule and reign. It's about the transformation of people, but not the transformation of
societies and cultures.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that you won't experience some micro transformations. I mean, Babylon experienced some micro transformations through the faithfulness of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but that wasn't the goal. It was through their faithful presence that the king began to make room for them.
Sure.
And that anybody who attacked them, they actually experienced consequences.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that there won't be any micro transformations. We saw that even with the Roman Empire in the first 3 centuries of the church's existence. Eventually, not only did Rome make room for them, in some sense, they put Christianity on the throne and saying, hey, you're now our new official religion. But then that's where when you look at the history of the church, though, that there are some dark periods because the church, when they became the cultural power and the center of power, is that they tear down idols. That's what they do. They go around and start tearing down the idols of the Roman Empire. Now they institute the church, and so when you had the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the church was in Rome, centered around Rome. When you had the western part of the Roman Empire, it was Constantinople. So in some sense, you had the center church. So I mean, again, they're doing what Israel did, and that's not what God had called Israel to do. The exiles, that is not what Jesus called His church to do. But nevertheless, this is what they're doing, and then they're instituting ecclesial law. And then what you end up finding is that they're forcing communities of people to follow this now civil religion, and sometimes even by force through the sword. And then the church becomes abusive, and they start implementing these laws that Jesus never even told His church, like the laws of indulgences. Like if you want your soul saved, then you need to give to build. Like, oh my gosh, are you talking about like an abuse of power and an abuse that Jesus now, like they're abusing it in a way where like you can't even find it in the Bible. And so what they did is they're trying to transform Rome into the church. That's not what Jesus called His people to do. That's not what Paul called the church to do. And then you always had these pockets, though, throughout church history. You always had these pockets of remnants that always went back to the Scriptures and said, what do the Scriptures say?
Wow. It's amazing. Well, in that 5th point, God didn't tell them to assimilate into the culture of Babylon. What I love about that is you connected it then to Exodus 19. Whose they are, who they are, and what they do. So God's treasured possession, a kingdom of priests as mediators, and a holy and distinct nation. Then you gave this zinger. We must be careful not to become American Christians, but Christians who live in America. That's actually something that you've been intentional about on this podcast for quite a while, because it is easy for us to just say, American Christians, American Christianity, and we really want to be intentional about creating that distinction.
Yeah, and this is where I'm just I'm convicted. When I say and I don't even know if I can even articulate the conviction. The conviction is are we the distinct followers that Jesus died and rose for? Or are we trying to blend in, kind of put our head down, just like... So, I'm watching The Chosen, and I mean, I love it. And, sure, do they take some liberties? They do. Do I think we ought to boycott them and, criticize? Like, no, if it was anti-biblical, sure, I would say something, but I have not seen anything that gives me concern. The things that they do, actually, it points me to this rub, like, as I'm watching it now in season 4, where Jesus is kind of frustrated with his followers, and he's talking to his mom about it, and I'm like, okay, well, I wonder if he's really talking to his mom, but he's frustrated. They're not getting it. But I think here's the thing, like, so what does it really mean for Jesus to lay down his full divinity and still, when I say be shielded, where he's still fully God and fully man, right? Because so he's frustrated. So, can you be frustrated and not sin? I think you can. I think you can be frustrated. So he's frustrated with his followers of not getting it because they haven't fully understood like the life he's calling them to do. Yeah. And like an example would be when he says, when the word talks about that if a Roman soldier forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. Okay. And so there's a scene where that happens, and Jesus tells the Roman soldiers, hey, aren't you going up here? Well, we'll just go with you another mile. And all of the disciples are like, why are we doing this? We ain't got to. Like, because they were good Jews. Yeah. Yeah. Jesus wasn't calling them to be a good Jew. Jesus was calling them to God's kingdom. And they couldn't wrap their mind around it because it's going to cost them something. It was going to be even more humiliating. But in it being more humiliating, now what he's doing is that instead of them now being in charge, what you are showing them is that God ultimately is in charge. Is that while they only could have forced you by law to go 1 mile, God is going to tell you to go 2, which is now going to change the way they see you. Because now in that scene, the Roman soldiers couldn't even believe their eyes that they're willing in a good spirit to go 2 miles. Wow. Not begrudgingly, but graciously. Wow. And so that's where we got to get back to, what does it mean to be a Christ follower? And what does it mean to be a Christ follower in America? Because depending on, and this is where I keep saying about the rudimentary understanding of the society in which you live, because if you're living in China, or if you're living in Venezuela, or if you're living in Brazil, there might be some nuances of how you as a Christian engage the culture of China, of Venezuela, of Canada, but you're always going to start with what is the vision that Jesus has of his followers, and how does that navigate and play itself out in this context in which we live. But what typically happens, though, and again, we see this throughout history. I mean, we see it in the Babylonian exile. We saw it in, you actually see it in the Assyrian exile. Do you know where Samaritans came from? It's where the Jews intermingled with the Assyrians, and they became Samaritans. So that's why Jesus would, when he comes on the scene, Jews, fully ethnic Jews, didn't even want to go through Samaria because in their eyes they had fully assimilated into Jews marrying Assyrians. Therefore, they are Samaritans. So and then you see that also with some of the Babylonian Jews, or when I say the Babylonian exile and Jews, and then you see it throughout history, is that our tendency is to acquiesce, to assimilate, to be, when I say fully integrated into becoming just like the culture. And that's not what Jesus called us to do. And that's where the conviction is, like, how can we live out that vision where America, in many pockets of America, parents and schools and recreation leagues have made sports the God. How can we play sports, not making it the God or a God, but a way by which we glorify our God? And so that And we have to wrestle with that. And I don't think it's just cut and dry. I don't think it is just completely acquiescing to, well, we play all the time, we give all this money, and we never go to church. Like, I don't actually think, but what is a way where you can use your talents for our King in a way that he puts you in front of these, these people that in some sense will worship that sport without capitulating and making that sport your God. Money, business. What are ways that businessmen and women can worship our King without making the dollar king? That's where I'm saying we got to make sure that we maintain our distinctiveness as Christians who live in America versus American Christians.
Well, and that really leads to the way you ended this first talk was, how does this relate to Jesus?
Yeah.
And you gave those 5 points, and this is where we'll end today. So I'll lay out those 5 points and then see what other thoughts you have about them. So Christ wasn't paralyzed by Adam and Eve's sin. Christ didn't withdraw, retreat, or isolate himself from the city of man. So all of these connect to the 5, right? Christ didn't retaliate and seek revenge. He didn't come to transform the structures of the empire, but worked to construct a new one subversively. And finally, he didn't assimilate to the culture's pressures, but maintained his distinctiveness. Certainly that 5th one you pointed out and gave us an example. Any of the other ones you want to talk about further?
No, I think those are good and a good place to end part 1. So stay tuned to part 2 next week. So Northland, family and friends, you're greatly loved. Blessings.
Thanks for listening to Extra Takes. Be sure to follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts so you won't miss a single episode.